My name is Matt Wooster. I made my decision for Christ in the spring of 2014, and this is my dad, Jim Wooster. From a world system standpoint, I was really achieving exactly what people of my age are supposed to achieve, or so I thought, making quite a bit of money, had a lot of acquaintances. I think I would have called them friends at the time, but knew a lot of people. Every decision I made was sort of selfish and was with me in mind. Hour to hour, that kind of worked fine, but when I laid my head down on the pillow, I was pretty unhappy with just the way things were going. In 2008, I was working at fancy finance firm, and kind of later in the day, probably 5 or 6 o'clock, I lost peripheral vision in my left eye. It took about an hour or so, but I finally got in to see the emergency room doctor. They did a whole battery of tests, and one of them that they did was a CT scan of my brain. At the time, they were just calling this thing that they found on my brain a lesion. Kind of the course of action from there was to get an MRI scan of my brain every 3 months, and they would see if this lesion area was growing in my brain. And so I was sort of just accepting of that as the course of action. But that day when I left the hospital, I called my dad.
We were driving towards Cleveland, and I remember getting that phone call, and he said, I have a brain tumor. And that's not what you want to hear. 2010,
decided I had my first brain surgery. And that night is really where kind of my spiritual story begins. The night before my surgery, I guess I would call it a prayer now. I don't think I would have called it at the time. It was more of like just kind of a bargain with God or a higher power or something. I said something to the effect of that night before I went to sleep, like, I'm so scared about what's gonna happen tomorrow. Just get me through this. I just want to go back to my life of using people, making money, having fun, partying, all this. Like, I don't understand any of this serious thing happening to me. Just get me through this. I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night and just felt like this peace and serenity come over me. Just like everything, all this anxiety and everything I felt just sort of went away, and I just felt like everything's gonna be fine. Next day, had the surgery. It was a successful surgery. Later in 2010, moved here, got a job. It came back in 2013, so again in March of 2013, the doctors suggested, let's go ahead and have another surgery. And so that's exactly what we did. Another full resection of the tumor. This time the pathology came back and it was a grade 3 tumor, grade 3, so it increased in severity. For that reason, doctors made the decision this time to do chemo and radiation. As my hair finally started to grow back, this is the next part of the spiritual conversation. My wife, who got her hair cut by a girl who's, her married name is Sarah Hatfield. She's a Xenos member, and that's who's cutting her hair. My wife said, man, you should go see Sarah at night, like after hours, so no one else is in the shop when you do it. And so I was like, oh, that sounds great, because I was always just so self-conscious. And she shared a little bit about their church, Xenos, and her husband David, and kind of what I was going through, and invited Angie and I out. So some Sunday in the fall of 2013, we came here to the main campus, and it was an evening CT service, and Jim Leffel was teaching that night, and I heard the gospel for the first time in my life, and Jim articulated it in a way that was just amazing. He even told a story that night of, I believe, his daughter, who was friends with somebody in Chicago who was going through a brain tumor, and experienced the peace of their relationship with God. And I just remember Angie and I kind of looking at each other at one point in the service, just being like, this is way too much of a coincidence. And I mean, yeah, just hearing the gospel, I'm like, if that's true, I really want to research that and understand it. Made my decision in the spring of 2014. God's given me my story and he wants me to use it. And so that's really one of the things I've tried to do, is share my story with a lot of other people.
He said, Dad, I know where I'm going to go when I die. And at that time, I thought he was really maybe close to death. He said, and I want you and Mom to be there too. So And I really didn't understand what he meant, and he did a very good job of explaining it to me. I was going to a nice country church in Sandusky, Ohio, that I really liked the people, but he said, you need somebody to teach you the gospel. You need somebody to mentor you. You need to understand the free gift of grace. So that's what I did, and how do I go about that? And fortunately, I went to Zenos' website, and as you know, all the teachings are there, and Matt said the gospel, so I said, I'm going to listen to teachings from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so I did, and I understood for the first time, it really made sense. I made the decision 3 years ago, the day before my birthday, just a little over 3 years ago, and that was at 68 years old. I hope it's an encouragement to some of the younger members of Zenos that they can convince their parents that may not have made that decision that it's possible. It's been nothing but good news since.